welcome to Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer. I'm Dr. Greer, and I'd like to thank the folks at the World Puja Network for hosting us here every 2 weeks to bring you insight and perspective on the work that we're working on. As you know, we're bringing out a new film soon called Sirius, and you can find out about that at sirius.neverendinglight.com. And I'm very excited today to have a really special guest. His name is Michael Short, and he is someone who's worked for many years in the tech area and editing films. And he was networked to us recently by a mutual friend, and he has done something really quite amazing with Peace Day TV at the UN and other places, and is chairman of All Things Peace, a nonprofit organization, and is very dedicated to the concepts of world peace, and we're now going to introduce the concepts of universal peace, because this is a universal moment in which we find ourselves here at the end of 2012. And a good part of what we're going to be focusing on, because Michael Short's doing some very special events around the end of the Mayan calendar and what all that means and the various perspectives on it. So I'm very excited to have Michael here with us. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't you share with the listeners a little bit about what you're working on and how you got involved with all this?
Yes. Well, we're working on a global broadcast that will be mostly done on the Internet. Portions of it could be picked up by other networks, satellite networks or television networks. But Peace Day Television, or peaceday.tv as we call it, is a project that we started on the Internet. We started it for the United Nations International Day of Peace, which is the 21st of September every year.
Right.
And on that day, there are global events that take place around the world for various peace activities, peace-related organizations, people who are following the Millennium Development Goals, which were set out by the UN several years ago. Do things like eradicate hunger and poverty and so forth. A couple years ago, they did a review of those goals. And so instead of just one day on peace, we had about a week's worth of events taking place around the world. And over time, we have been developing here a very complex studio that we're building ourselves that allows us to accept media streams of information coming live from events around the world, and then basically repackage them into a channel of information that we call peaceday.tv. And then we rebroadcast that out to the world. And so I said, well, we're going to do this as a nonprofit production company. We really want to achieve peace, and we don't want it to be one day a year. We want it to be every day. I mean, that's our goal.
Right.
So we started gathering the content, talking to people, creating relationships, and now we're full-time 24/7 broadcasting, and we have audiences of millions over the course of the year that people tune into us, and fresh new content. And so we have this sort of unique capability with our staff and with our technology to do a global broadcast and receive events. So we started getting contacts a few months ago about the upcoming solstice. And people are saying, hey, we're going to do a global broadcast, but we don't know how to do it. So everyone keeps giving me your name and number. And I was just really amazed at the number of events and the types of events related to the solstice that were taking place around the world. And we had already planned to do something about the solstice, and we had some content coming in, and we were getting ready to produce this. To make a long story short, over the course of the past couple of months, these events, which we have over 50 of them now on the list that are taking place, and there are many, many more events, but 50 of them are significant, like at Stonehenge and Chichen Itza and Teotihuacan and places like that,
right.
With a lot of luminaries and whatnot. And they basically are all converging into a big global broadcast that will be found all over the Internet, and we're just very excited about it.
Well, great. Yeah, because you have a great background technically, and of course we were talking the other day when we first had our discussion about the meaning of this date, and of course this gets into a lot of different viewpoints, but of course, my view of it is that it's actually part of the end of one cycle and the opening of another. Of course, it's always been, the media always takes it and turns it into a caricature of the end of the world, and could you be more stupid? But in reality, it's the end of an old world and it's the beginning of a new, and so you can look at it as apocalyptic. I guess what I tell people, the people who have their talons into the old order that's collapsing all around us, whether it be economic, religious, and governmental, institutional, what have you, it's apocalyptic for them because they're going down with the ship. But in reality, there is an entirely new civilization emerging, and so we live with these eddy currents of the collapse of the old and the emergence of the new. And so what I choose to focus on is the emergence of the new. And the new is not only a time of world peace, which I think is cliche and old and so 1960s, I think I'm going to vomit, but universal peace. And the universal peace is really where it's at, because we have civilizations visiting this planet that we can prove and have done through the Disclosure Project. CSETI is making contact with these civilizations in various transdimensional and interesting ways, and this is totally off the radar scope of most people, and yet here we are emerging as a universal civilization, and that's what's really exciting. And with it, I think we're going to have to emerge into a period of not just universal peace, but also the concepts of universal physics, because the physics and the science behind this time is what's also going to parallel the development of consciousness and higher states of consciousness. So I don't know. I'd just like to hear your kind of view on how this is all emerging and how you're seeing people see this time, this solstice period and the end of the Mayan calendar as you're putting this together, and what your views on it are.
Well, for one thing, the Mayans don't believe it's the end of the world, and they're going to make a statement live on the broadcast about that. It really is the beginning of a new era for them. We've also gathered a bunch of elders from various Aboriginal tribes, including the Hopis and others that have their own prophecies, which kind of coincide with that.
Right.
And they all agree that this is a new emerging age that from my personal experience, and a lot of people don't know this because I don't share this because I don't basically have the opportunity, but I have had many sightings of UFOs where I have had telescopes and witnesses and all kinds of people with me, so I'm not alone there. And I've had contact, not directly, but I've been contacted as early as the 90s by people saying, they know that in the future you're going to do something to help get the message out to many people who need to hear it. And I think that that's what's going on now. I have been putting together the treatment for the show, and I started with pure science, like I said, the physics of things, and I'm really amazed at how advanced science is. And you look at this, if nothing else, please enjoy this, because this is a very unique solstice. It's a unique timing of the solstice.
Right.
It is the end of different great cycles, like this is the Mayan Baktun, and it's the 13th one. Although there are experts coming on the show that have found new calendars in Guatemala and new hieroglyphics that say that there's more Baktuns ahead. I mean, obviously they don't think it's the end of the world like Hollywood thinks it. But it's also the end of the grand procession of the zodiac.
Right.
And there really is a galactic alignment, the center of the galaxy. So if nothing else, enjoy the science and enjoy what that means. But as I have been researching it and talking to the people who are around the world preparing their events, I'm finding that it's fascinating that the story is that there is a new age. Even the Kali Yuga, which we're in now, says that we're close to the golden age. There's various people who believe that there's an enlightenment coming, a higher consciousness. And I think that's the glue that I'm finding with, if you're thinking about UFO encounters, if you're talking about a society that can benefit from free energy devices, if you're talking about respect, return to the respect for Mother Earth, and cleaning up the pollution and return to the ways of organic gardening and things. Whatever it is, this higher consciousness comes out in all of the stories. And even in my last conversation with you, I was pretty fascinated about your uptake on the fact that here's why we don't have free energy right now, and here's why we're not welcome yet out into the galaxy, because we have to reach a higher consciousness level and get away from the tribal warfare, me society concept. So I'm finding that as a common thread throughout all of these different spokes on the wheel here for this show.
Well, I think one of the key things is that our society is always a reflection of the aggregate consciousness and level of consciousness of its people. And this is something we have to own. It isn't to say every individual is at that aggregate. But the reality is, if you look at our society right now in 2012, we have a lot of wonderful things happening. On the other hand, we are destroying the biosphere, and there are 7 billion people trying to live burning oil and gas and coal and using nuclear power, which obviously creates enormous life-destroying radiation. And all of those are destructive technologies. What's interesting is that if you look at the technologies that are interstellar and transdimensional, they draw energy in a harmless way with very elegant electrical engineering from the quantum vacuum of space, out of the zero-point energy field that's around us. I mean, sitting in the room where you're listening, everyone should visualize that every cubic centimeter of space has enough energy to run the Earth for a day, embedded within the fabric of space-time. And this has been proven in physics. The Casimir effect was very well proven. There have been experiments with this going back 100 years. There have been operational devices for almost that amount of time, and there have been anti-gravity propulsion devices at my uncle's old company, Northrop Grumman. Of course, my uncle designed the lunar module and worked on that project with Grumman, and it became Northrop Grumman, but also Lockheed Martin and the Skunk Works have had these anti-gravity electromagnetic devices. And yet, because of the consciousness of greed and fear and lower chakra impulses and lower consciousness impulses, these technologies and breakthroughs and great truths have been hidden. So my autobiography is called Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge for a reason, because this is the hidden truth and the forbidden knowledge that you just whisper about in the corridors of power in Washington, where I have a home and where I meet with people frequently. And it's a sad situation on one level. On the other level, it's a very hopeful situation, because what I tell people is that most people don't realize that we already have extant on the earth right now, at this instant, the technologies and the sciences that could give us a sustainable civilization without pollution, without poverty, and without conflict and war for hundreds of thousands or millions of years, and we have it already. That's the good news. The bad news is that you have a bunch of misanthropic nut jobs who, I don't know what their problem is. They weren't nursed long enough by their mothers or were weaned too quickly. I don't know what it is. Who have kept this secret from us and who have ruthlessly suppressed its emergence. So this is, however, a result of another level of consciousness, and that is the consciousness of fear. And what I have found with scientists and physicists and government people is that they're afraid to step into the buzzsaw, as Gore Vidal, in the book Into the Buzzsaw that Gore Vidal wrote the preface for. of controversy on this issue because the issue has been pigeonholed into something ridiculous or ridiculed, but also because they're very powerful interests. You're stepping on their toes. You're stepping on the toes of the big multi-hundred trillion dollar oil, gas, and coal interests. But this speaks to then why. Why hasn't the public stood up to this? And ultimately, I was recently reading in the New Republic a very interesting article written by someone reflecting on how people give their power to tyranny. And that this is that the tyrant is actually, it's like when you see Muammar Gaddafi crawling out of a sewer, and you see Saddam Hussein coming out of his spider hole, and you see, these tyrants, and the ones that are the secret tyrants are the worst, they really are very pathetic little people. And yet we, the people, have given our power over to them. And so we have to take that power back, and not in a bloody revolution. We just have to say, enough of this. You nut jobs, stand down, and we're going to bring out the truth about our future, the truth about science and technologies that have been hidden and forbidden, the truth about the fact that we are in an entirely new era, but we've been retarded 100 years off our evolutionary path because of silliness, greed, fear, acquisition of enormous amounts of centralized power. And these are all things that are in turmoil right now. And of course, the reason we're facing an economic implosion is because the world the entire financial system is built on a house of cards. It's also about to implode, and everyone knows it. So this is all because of the reflection of not only people who have been in leadership position, but the people willfully being either ignorant or apathetic. And so I see this period right now as a call to action, a call to enlightened action that has to be driven by a consciousness that is based in the Vedic concept of universal mind, of the samadhi state. Because you cannot bring this sort of information out into a level of consciousness that would then take it and flip it right back into a weapon to create more wars. So the consciousness behind it is the central thing that has to be developed. At the same time, the information and the actual physical technologies come out. Now, that's a lot to line up. It's like the slot machine, and you have to click, 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 click. But I think that's what this is all about. I think this period in time is about everything lining up, click, 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 because it has to be not only, it's not either or, it's and it's going to need to be consciousness and higher consciousness lining up with science and technology, lining up with the spiritual courage, the Shambhala warrior state, to stand up to people who would try to dominate the situation of a lower consciousness. And this does not mean violent conflict. It just means learning to say no to people who people tend to cower in fear of. And I've seen this so often with people who work in SCIFs, Secure Communication Intelligence Facilities, which are high-tech underground facilities that work on all these technologies. I know a number of them personally. And, they would love to come forward with these sciences and technologies, but they're terrified, and they've been told if you do so, you're dead. So there's an element here where we have to come together as a people, learn about these issues, and stand up to the schoolyard bullies, because ultimately these bullies will stand down when we stand up. So,
right.
And this is a dynamic which is lost on a lot of people who want to sit around and sing Kumbaya, which is great, but the Kumbaya has to be followed by some sort of dynamic action that actually results in helping the people of the world, the innocent people of the world. The average person on planet Earth just wants to live a peaceful life and be able to feed their children and be educated and have a good and joyful life on this planet. However, the thing that we have to accept is that the level of consciousness of the planet is the first thing that has to be potentiated. Now, what I hope from this transformative, this juggernaut of interest around the Mayan calendar is there'll be a new sort of energizing of the focus on the development of higher states of consciousness, which must serve as the foundation for the guiding principles of a new civilization. And this new civilization is going to be more different from today than we are from the ancient Mayans, and that can happen in 20 years.
I agree. I think that it could happen in a short time frame. I think there's kind of two classifications of guests and people that we're going to have on the show, and one of them are people who actually believe that the Earth is transitioning with the solar system through a part of the galaxy that's going to spontaneously cause a shift in consciousness, and the other half of the people just really expect that, hey, if we can start to reveal the truth to people and people can finally accept it, then that's all it's going to take, because if enough people do stand up to the bullies and say, we're not going to take this anymore. I mean, you know, I used to work in the 70s for one of the big auto manufacturers, and we were getting our cars to run, you know, V8 engines at 70, 80 miles per gallon back then, but we weren't allowed to get that onto an assembly line ever. And we know why. We were told what to tell the press or people if they actually found out, and we know, you know, why. It's the big multi-trillion-dollar oil business that you mentioned. They have a lot of control. But if people knew that for the past 40 years they've been paying this hidden tax to the tune of that could have ended poverty, for crying out loud, or 26% of the children in America are actually undernourished. They're hungry. They go to bed hungry. That's a tragedy.
Sure,
so
I did. I was one of those children when I was growing up. I absolutely remember.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. So if people awaken to the truth, I don't think the Earth has to go through some vibrational shift and into some new energy zone in the universe to have this happen. I think they just need to be awakened by people coming forth. Like, this is why I love your new movie and I love your Disclosure Project and everything, because enough people are there to hear the message that you're in a position where if one person tells another person, they can write it off. They can say, well, yeah, that person's kooky, or that person might be hearing, you know, rumors or whatever. But if enough people come forth and enough people hear it, that is consciousness shifting at that level.
Right. I recently had a medical doctor and also a scientist approach us, my wife and me, in the last year and said, look, you know, we had no idea any of this could be true, but we stumbled across the National Press Club event that we did over a decade ago, and then these DVDs that we have of these top secret guys talking, and where there's smoke, there's fire. And then it turned out that the wife, who was a medical doctor, an internist, had a sighting when they were in their courtship back in college that she had never told her husband about in 40 years of marriage. It was hilarious.
Wow.
And it was a very close encounter in Canada, and they were out backpacking, and this craft materialized over a lake in broad daylight near sunset, but it was still daytime. And she never even told her husband this story for fear that she might be rejected. Now, what's interesting is that this psychological thread runs back to the early 1950s when I have a document from the CIA where it talks about the psychological warfare value of the UFO subject. And they, at that time, engaged Disney Studios to make cartoons about little green men and absurdities with the flying saucers, so that people would make this a subject of kookiness and levity and dismiss it. And for whatever people want to say, the folks who do this psychological conditioning and propagandizing of issues in society are really very good at what they do. It's very bad what they do, but they're very good at it. If you doubt my opinion, ask someone who survived the Holocaust, because the only way Hitler and his minions pulled that off was through the propagandizing and the demonizing of Jewish people. And so this is exactly what's going on now with the UFO and ET subject, and you witness out of Hollywood in the last 2 years, there have been 18 movies that have been xenophobic portrayals of Earth and humans fighting aliens, like Battle Los Angeles and all that garbage. Right. The reason they're putting $2 billion into these kind of movies and we're having to crowdfund with a few $1,000s our film, is because the message they want to get out to people, to brainwash, just like Hitler did, is that, yes, they're out there. However, we need to get trillions of dollars back going into the military-industrial complex because we're chasing 70 al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and we're spending $115 billion a year doing that foolishness. And we need to build this into a space program, which is what Wernher von Braun warned through our witness, Carol Rosin, and that if we aren't able to demonize the ETs, how are we going to convince the population of the Earth that there's a threat out there? And so about 90% of the UFO subculture and 90% of the New Age subculture is inundated with custom-made intelligence propaganda that's designed to create this psychological effect. Now, I mean, I personally know the man in charge of these programs at the CIA. He's appalled at what's happening, and he has been, because he's a cog in the machine, but he's been encouraging me, and I've never said this publicly, I'll say it today, since the early 1990s to lead an effort in another direction towards peaceful contact, universal peace, bringing out this information, but in a way that isn't spun by the spinmeisters into this fearsome presence that's out there that we need to sort of organize the world's people around a new threat. And it's interesting how often you have, from Ronald Reagan and other leaders, where they have publicly said, if there was a common alien threat, we could unite the world. Well, why I think this is a very backward way of looking at how we can create peace and unity, is to create a bigger enemy in space. And this is what these nut jobs who really want to propagandize this. And so there's a risk with disclosure. I wrote a paper many years ago called When Disclosure Serves Secrecy. You have to be very careful. Whose disclosure? How is it being portrayed? What is being said? And so one of the things we're going to do in the film Sirius, and again, people can find out about that at sirius.neverendinglight.com. We hope to finish it in the next month, and how we're going to roll it out, I don't know. We really don't have the budget yet to do that. But maybe, Michael Short, you can network this onto your streaming. But what we need to be able to do is convince people that there is actually no reason to be afraid of anything going into the future except humans manipulating each other back into this dark corner of war, which I want to tell you a little interesting story since you're involved with the UN, and I don't know how much you're involved, Michael, with the Office of the Secretary General and folks like that. But back some years ago, there was a UN Secretary General named Boutros Ghali, and he's Egyptian, by the way. And I don't know if you knew him or not, and his wife. Well, they had invited me to an event in New York, and I gave a presentation. And then Leah Ghali, his wife, who was a wonderful, wonderful woman, invited me to do a presentation at the UN and on this issue, on taking weapons out of space, keeping space for peaceful exploration, making peaceful contact with ETs, and the whole UFO issue. Believe it or not, I did an actual presentation at the UN on all this. So she greets me at the front entrance of the UN, and she grabs me by the arm, and we're walking into the Great Hall, and all of you have been to the UN building, and we're going through this Great Hall, and I have my little daughter with me at the time, one of my 4 daughters, and she turns to me and she says, and sort of hisses, she says, "When are you going to get this done?" And I said, excuse me? I'm working full-time as an emergency doctor, taking care of shootings and stabbings and car wrecks and heart attacks and all that stuff. And I'm up there doing this as a pro bono thing because I'm concerned about the state of the world. And she says, "We need you to get this information out." I said, "Leah, I'm just a country doctor from North Carolina." She says, "No, you must do it." I said, "Well, your husband is head of the world. He's the Secretary General of the UN." She's looked at me with eyes wide open. She says, "No, it's too dangerous for Boutros. They'll kill Boutros." And I just stopped. I said, well, don't say this in front of my daughter. What is that? What am I, chopped liver? And so, it was this hilarious scene that really someday should be in a movie. But there I am. And this was, as I began to have these meetings, I realized the amount of fear there is. And so fear is the mind killer and the spirit killer. And ultimately what we have to do is say, okay, enough of that nonsense. The consciousness that enables us to have the courage to speak truth to power is the Shambhala warrior state. And it's not a state of violence. It's a state of universal peace and actualization. And, before I was a medical doctor, I spent many years teaching people meditation and the Vedas and Sanskrit and through a mantra meditation approach. And what I found is that if you have the experience of universal consciousness, pure consciousness, of enlightenment, you don't have any fear anymore. It's like people who've also had near-death experiences where they experience the fact that we are, in fact, eternal and omnipresent, and our innermost light of consciousness is this omnipresent field. Then what are you going to be afraid of? So, and I think this is the state of the fearless state that since we're on the World Puja show, that Krishna, when he was speaking to Arjuna on the battlefield and said, a little of this eliminates all fear, and the this was a capital T, and he was referring to this state of higher enlightened consciousness where it goes and transcends your individuality and ego into that unbounded, pure state of mind that is the one mind of the cosmos. And that, to me, is the real meaning of this time, is that more and more people are not only going to know about that, but experience it, experientially realize it, which is what enlightenment is. And even the early physicist, the father of particle wave theories, Erwin Schrödinger, said the total number of minds in the universe is one. That is, it is a singularity. And so the experience of that singularity creates the ability to stand up to someone at the CIA and say, this is nonsense, and you've had a nice ride for 50 or 60 years doing this. It's time to change. Now, a lot of people are kind of appalled when they hear this. And I said, no, I met with the head of Army Intelligence once, and he threatened me. I said, look, you get in my way, I'll see that you're in Leavenworth. Move. So you have to be, you cannot be a namby-pamby and take on these kind of interests. On the same time, it has to be coming from some higher state of consciousness. And so what we have to, I think this whole period that we're in right now is bringing heaven and earth together in the Chinese sense. We have to bring this enlightened state into actuality and action where we manifest a world that is we have glimpses of. I can see the future that awaits us. It's been forestalled, unfortunately, for longer than it should be, but it can definitely appear. And I think this is about bringing the people into that process, because the morphogenic field that Sheldrake talks about, the more people who come into this state of understanding, the more it potentiates it non-locally to people who don't even know it yet. So the nature of mind and consciousness and space and time is that it's a self-aware conscious universe. And so when people begin to realize this information, it really has an effect on folks globally and I think even interplanetarily. I always tell people this is not just an Earth phenomenon. This is a universal phenomenon. We're not in an Earth cycle. We're emerging into a universal cycle. And this is something not talked about since we tend to be self-centered. In reality, I think the period we're emerging into right now is not just a big transformative moment on Earth, but it's happening on multiple planets simultaneously, and it is a universal cycle.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, you've inspired me with my allthingspeace.org is my 501c3, but you've inspired me because I've been concerned since the 70s. Back then I read a report from a think tank about how to extend the military-industrial complex. And in that report, they actually said, use war in the vernacular over and over again as a solution. The war on poverty, the war on drugs, and eventually introduce a war on terror, because you can't prove a terror. And everyone's afraid of the lone assassin and the terrorist. But even that's going to get old. And this report said you have got to create a illusion of a war against aliens, because the average person just has to take your word for it that they're being invaded from outer space. I read this in the 70s, and I watched everything unfold with the war on drugs and the war on poverty and then the war on terror, and now I see the Hollywood kicking up the story, which is really just it's controlling the message, it's controlling the thought process, which Hollywood and Madison Avenue and the like, they're very powerful and they're very good at what they do.
Right.
I was in a meeting in Madison Avenue where they said we are trendsetters, and they were bragging to each other. They said we're going to set a new trend. This was years ago. They said the trend's going to be body art and tattoos, and within 10 years, that became more than a fad. It became really, really popular, and they did it through controlling the message in every aspect of the media.
Right.
So I'm thinking we shouldn't be trying to achieve just a global peace or peace on Earth. It should be a galactic peace. It should be, universal peace, as you say.
Yeah, the galaxy's too small, by the way, because our group, if you go to cseti.org, has a photograph of a extraterrestrial being that visited us transdimensionally that actually appeared in a photograph a couple of years ago at Joshua Tree National Park, and he was from the Andromeda Galaxy, which is actually several million light years from our galaxy. It's the closest galaxy, and this was an actual contact. This is probably one of the most important photographs ever taken in history, and it was very real. And we had a group of people out in the desert using the remote viewing and consciousness protocols, and a sphere appeared, and then someone took a picture, and in this picture is this man waving at us, and he is clearly not human, but we later learned he told us mentally that he was from the Andromeda Galaxy. And so what you find, and we had all of our electronics were going nuts while this was happening, because we have electronic interface with these transdimensional teleportation systems that very advanced ETs use when they're zipping around like that. And what was fascinating about this contact experience is that I had just been talking that day to our training group, because I train people to make contact doing this, that in fact this is not just involving our galaxy, because someone kept talking about our galaxy and a galactic. I said, no. There are hundreds of billions of galaxies, of which the Milky Way, with our 100 billion star system, is only a speck. It's a relatively small and minor galaxy. The cosmos is unbelievably huge. But the nearby are twin. And in fact, what's interesting about the Andromeda Galaxy, it's almost the same size and shape with the same number of stars as the Milky Way. So they're sort of twin galaxies, which I think is beautiful. And so this particular ambassador who was sent to us was from Andromeda. And I know, as far out as that sounds, we actually have a photograph of him. His name is Bijou. And so this is the sort of thing that shocks people when they first hear about it. Are you kidding me? We're just now learning about the fact that UFOs have been kept secret, and you guys are out there virtually shaking hands with the ambassadors from the Andromeda Galaxy. And I said, well, time marches on, and, people are just now discovering what should have been known 100 years ago, but meanwhile, we're already 100 years into this new era. By the way, amongst many Vedic scholars, we're already in the early stages of this age of enlightenment and the ending of the Kali Yuga. And I think that if you look at the teachings from the Hopi, the Vedic teachings, certainly the Baha'is have this in their teachings and prophecy. If you look at the Buddhist teachings, there are many teachings that talk about this and a sort of the return. Now, of course, that gets turned into sort of a messianic return, but in reality, it's this greater sort of unveiling of a whole new cycle of development, the hallmark of which is enlightenment and universal peace, and the amazing developments of potential in terms of integration of our planet. I mean, 100 years ago, no one could have envisioned the kind of telecommunications you've worked on, Michael. And for that matter, most people who the idea that in 1954 these projects went black. I know the men who worked on them way back then, but we've had operational devices that would take us from here to Paris in a few seconds, fully operational. Since 1954. What's interesting, a lot of this anti-gravity research was in the open aerospace journal literature. Most of those journals have been snarfed up and burned or put away. And it all was being discussed fairly openly in the late 40s and early 50s. In October 1954, I'll give you that date, it all went black. And the reason it did is that we had enough breakthroughs that we actually developed operational devices that became part of a secret Air Force and Space Force, and those have been fully operational since then. Now, I wasn't born until 1955, but what's interesting is that when you look at the history of this, we're really about 50 or 60 years behind what people think we have, because everyone's sort of enthralled with, the space shuttle. Or I was just meeting with Richard Branson's person who is selling tickets on his little plane that goes to space and back for $200,000. Right. You can take a ride. And I just smiled and I said, yes, that's circa 1940s technology, just so you know. Everything since the 40s is in a black box. And they just looked at me in this astonished way. And then I went into this whole discussion of the work that we've done, that you can see at the orionproject.org, unveiling the work of T. Townsend Brown and others that in the 1920s began doing high-voltage work electronically, causing mass cancellation and levitation, and that this was then developed even further by the 1940s and 50s, to the point now that these are fully operational systems. Unfortunately, the public simply doesn't know they exist. They're so-called black projects. But and again, the good news is that the science and technology is there. And one of the things that we're wanting to do, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, Michael, is that this film, Sirius, we're hoping to create a public groundswell of activism so that we can fund a new energy laboratory to bring out these technologies in a safe manner in the coming months and years, because many times individual inventors have found the secret of how to get energy from the vacuum, so-called free energy devices, and they always disappear. I've watched this happen for 20 years. So we feel we have to create a safe vehicle for developing and launching these technologies out to the public, and it has got to be very high profile. The reason like a network like yours is so important, Michael, is that the real shield isn't going to be from a tactical armored unit protecting us from doing this. It's going to be from millions of people learning about it and saying, by God, I'm not going to let this one go down. I'm not going to let this get suppressed. And I think that is why what you're doing is so important. One of the reasons it's so important.
Yeah, exactly. I have an acquaintance who did create a vehicle that used very little, like it actually used a 6-volt lamp battery and could go miles and miles with one single charge, and then, of course, recharge itself. And the CIA confiscated it. They threatened him, well, you want to go to jail for life, or do you just want to give us the technology? I have another friend that did work on a transporter project, and they could successfully transport people from, for instance, the U.S. to Australia in a matter of an instant.
Right.
And these technologies do exist, and I know they've had anti-gravity, and I think that you're right. I think that to be able to inform people, enough of them at the same time, that they should be living in a George Jetson world, and there's reasons that they don't.
Right.
They've been, suppressed for a bit too long. Now, I could see them suppressing it if they don't want it weaponized. I could see a lot of good reasons, but at the same time, you look around and you see war and poverty and pollution, the Gulf oil spill, things like the Fukushima. We've been tracking that we're one of the few networks that actually comes up and gets reports out of Fukushima that are real and then reports them. I'm on the west coast of the United States, and the city that's nearest where I live and one to the north of me are the two highest levels of radiation in the rain, way above normal.
Wow.
So the government, instead of doing anything, they don't even tell people. Instead of doing anything about it, they raised what they call the acceptable exposure levels are, so that they would match. So that if anyone checked, they wouldn't worry.
Yes, of course. Just change the data point.
They do. So yeah. So.
By the way, do any of these gentlemen that you knew that had these technologies, are they still alive, or would you think they would work with a project trying to bring these systems?
Oh, they would. As a matter of fact, I've had 2 offers by 2 different people who claim to have credible free interview devices to make announcements of such on the broadcast, and I'm very cautious about that. I don't want to get anybody in trouble. However, if I do have a big enough audience and these people are willing to, one of them is not in the United States at all.
Right.
So he's willing to make that announcement, and I have to be.
Well, there have been announcements over the years, like the Steorn group, but then they all disappear. What I would suggest to you, what would be more useful, hook them up with us so that we do this in a way so that we verify it, reproduce it, bring it out, and have about 1 billion people know about it all at once. That's really what we're going to have to do with this. Almost 1 billion people saw the Disclosure Project event in 2001. We're going to have to do this in a strategically very sophisticated way with verification, reproducibility. All the sine qua non of science is of course, reproducibility. And I think that this is something that, these sorts of folks, we need to pull our resources together and do. One thing that would also be helpful is that your experience with the automaker is suppressing the very high miles per gallon engine back in the 70s, and these other accounts that you've related, particularly the one about the next phase of war being alien war. That would be a very important thing if you'd be willing to be interviewed by the film Sirius. We could hook you up with our producers there in L.A. because I think that it would be great if you would say that on the record. We're looking for people who've had direct knowledge of this to say it on the record, like Carol Rosin did when she talked about Wernher von Braun basically saying, look, they're going to hoax a threat from outer space. And this was part, and that, he also said, quite separate from this document you read, he said to her on his deathbed, he had liver cancer, and Wernher von Braun, who, those of you who don't know, invented the rocket for Adolf Hitler, the V-2 rocket, became part of our space program in the United States. Wernher von Braun said that this was an appalling, maniacal, and stupid scheme, but that what they would do, they would first have the Cold War. That would be followed by nations of concern, and then it would be followed by global terrorism, and then it would be followed by a threat from outer space. First they'd start talking about asteroids, and then after that they'd bring in the whole alien threat. And he says this was all being planned and discussed in the 60s. So here we are in 2012, and all these movies are coming out, and the UFO research subculture has completely been frankly infiltrated by these sort of this kind of thinking. And unfortunately, we need people who are going to, I liken it to the Wizard of Oz standing behind the curtain scaring the bejeebies everyone with his crazy machine. We need folks like you, Michael, more people like you to come forward and just pull that curtain back and let people take a peek at what kind of deception and nonsense is really going on, because we can't afford to be fooled again on this one. It's like the song and we won't be fooled again, but we can't afford to be fooled again on this one. This is the big one. I mean, Vietnam was a disaster, the Iraq War was a disaster, all of that, 9/11 was a disaster, but this is the really, really, really big one. We can't afford to be fooled again. And so we need folks like you to step up to the plate and put this on the record that you have seen things like this. I mean, I'm just making that as an appeal to you right now.
Well, I am officially stepping up. This is one thing I'm doing anyway. That's why I'm creating this broadcast network. We have some interesting technologies we're going to be releasing too that will free people up from sort of the specter of what's been going on with propaganda or with repression of access to information. We'll be able to help that out. But, if people knew that when they figured out how we were getting such good gas mileage, that they even reformulated the gasoline. And I don't know if you ever hear those ads where you're going to leave your lawnmower in the garage all winter. You have to buy a little bottle of stabilizer to put in the gasoline,
right?
Because the formula now is much less stable than it was in the 70s and prior to that, because they don't want us doing what we did to get the better gas mileage.
Correct.
And so there's just so many instances of this and examples of this that I think that if people knew, and you listen to the politics of the day, and right now they're arguing about taxes, no new taxes. There's this fiscal cliff coming, but if you look at, for instance, every day when you pump gas into your vehicle, you're paying a hidden tax because you should be getting 200-300 miles per gallon by now, because this was 40 years ago. And probably, I think about 6% of the gasoline you put in your tank actually powers the vehicle.
Correct.
It's that inefficient of a device.
That's right.
Invented well over a century ago.
Right, we're Mercedes with the internal combustion engine. I always tell people who think we're so high tech with their iPhones and all this nonsense, and I said, yes, the digital stuff that was reverse engineered from the ETs has come out. Everything else hasn't. So you're powering your iPhone with a coal-fired power grid from the 1800s, a distribution grid system from the 1800s. You're driving around in a car, and I don't care if you have a Mercedes Maybach or a Rolls-Royce, it's an internal combustion engine from 1888. And if you're flying on a jet, jets were invented in the 1930s. And if you've gone into space, like my uncle's devices that took people to the moon, that is circa 1940s, Wernher von Braun. Everything else is in a black box, and those are the things that could give us a world of abundance, an environmental homeostasis where we're living in complete harmony with Gaia, and peace, because you cannot have peace where there's injustice and where you have half the world's population with literally no plumbing and not a pot to pee in. You're never going to have peace. So these are massive, huge issues that we have to take on, and we have to take them on immediately. And so it's really wonderful. I applaud you for what you're doing with your broadcast and bringing light to this and bringing a bigger perspective to this whole unfortunately, the silliness that's begun to surround this whole Mayan calendar and looking at it, what its true meaning is. Because to me, the true meaning of it is it's the end of one era and the opening of another yuga, another big cycle. And this is a universal cycle, and it's a cycle of not only enlightenment, but extraordinary development in sciences and technology and our society that is really beautiful and breathtaking, but there are retrograde forces that are trying to drag us back and keep us back in that old Kali Yuga. And so I think we have to come together as a people and say, well, that's fine, but you can only succeed, as all tyrants do, if we give our power to you. And we're not going to give our power to you anymore. We're going to come forward and create a new civilization and a world of our dreams, and that's what this time is all about.
Exactly right. And the closer we get to this solstice, the more contact I'm getting from people who are at least awakening to, well, what's it about? What's it really about? What's the Mayan calendar really mean? What's the solstice really, what can I do? Where can I go? I think we're going to have a huge audience, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to promote your movie and promote where we need to go with this. Because
well, if there's a way for me to be on the broadcast, like I was saying the other day, let me know if there's a camera person anywhere. It turns out I'm going to be in Miami on the 20th and 21st so we'll be in sunny Florida. We'll be celebrating the remains of Atlantis, being in the Christmas.
I believe we did find a camera person.
Oh, great!
Right in your town, yes, and you'll be getting an email regarding that. We would love to have you come on and share your perspective, and we will put that with the video that you sent me. And I think it's a very important key part of the explanation and bringing the information out about basically a new emerging age, a new emerging cycle.
Right, and and it's not all things are kind of new again. One of the things when I was interviewed, there was a History Channel series that some of you may have scene called, what was it? I never look at television, Ancient Aliens. And one of the things that they asked me about were, the connection. I said, look, I have folks I work with who are under contract to the CIA who have been given devices that are hundreds of thousands and some millions of years old that have been found in archaeological digs on Earth that are technological, that belong to prior civilizations that have been on Earth, and some of them may have belonged to extraterrestrial civilizations. But if you look at the historical record, it's quite clear, whether it be in medieval times with paintings or the Nazca lines in Peru or what have you, that there has been contact between these ancient peoples who have these prophecies and teachings about this time, and extraterrestrial civilizations that are out there who have been, some of them, I believe, I call them the guardians of life on Earth. They've been watching our development for hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of years, and are patiently waiting for us to grow up as a civilization. The hallmark of grown-upness, as I understand it, is living peacefully on our planet together, eschewing warfare, because that's when you're then a interplanetary cleared or capable people. We are not at that point yet. And one of the reasons why when we landed on the moon, I learned from a number of sources at NASA and elsewhere that when the lunar module that my uncle worked on landed on the moon with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in it, there were ET craft that were surrounding that crater. But they weren't particularly happy because the Cold War, the space program was a proxy for the Cold War, and we were actually doing this militarily in competition with the Soviet Union. And what the ETs really want us to do is to come together as a people, realize that our spiritual essence is one, that we are all one in spirit, and that we go into space with that consciousness of oneness and peace. Then the universe is going to fling its arms open to us and embrace us. But if we go out there as a bunch of squabbling monkeys with weapon systems, that dog don't hunt, as we say in North Carolina.
Right, absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely it, and I hope I've been studying the concept of ancient aliens for about 10 years, and that's why I like that television program.
Oh, I never saw it, but yeah,
it's really pretty good. In fact, I'm hoping to have David Wilcock and others have been invited to participate in the broadcast, and some of the hosts of that show, because I think that if people, and I hate to say this, but organized religions are great things, but they have caused an awful lot of bloodshed over the millennia.
Indeed.
On the planet Earth. And if people were to find out the influence of the relationship with alien visitors in the past, then they might take a better view of how to evolve their religions so that there's not my God's better than your God, and I'd fight you over it.
Exactly, right.
That's a big problem.
Oh, it's a huge problem. It's a problem all over the world. And I'm reminded of the philosopher George Santayana that said that fanaticism consists of redoubling your effort when you've forgotten your goal. It pretty much sums up all organized religion. In fact, I had a JPL scientist tell me once the reasons they didn't disclose the structures, that these ancient structures that are on Mars, is that they're very similar to some of the ancient structures in the Mayan world and the Egyptian world, and that it would give completely lay to rest all the creation myths, the people who think that the world is 6,000 or 8,000 years old and we rode dinosaurs bare. Well, but that's 25% of Americans believe we were dinosaurs bareback, and there's a museum in Kentucky to this. Well, he said that would completely collapse these orthodox and fundamentalist belief systems. And I said, well, good. He says, no, you don't understand the power of those groups. And here was a scientist at JPL explaining to me one of the reasons for the secrecy about these ancient structures was that it would challenge the fundamentalist juggernaut that was amok in the world. And I said, well, this is ridiculous. I said, this is childhood's end, man. I mean, it's like, grow up. People who want to believe that, they're free to believe it, but they're not free to foist it on the rest of us. or to establish policy for the jet propulsion labs. And unfortunately, that's what's happened, because this was a senior scientist at JPL that I know personally. And so there's an enormous amount of information like this that we need to begin to say, look, here's the truth about it. And if it doesn't conform with your belief systems, then you need to adjust your belief systems. But here are the facts, here's the evidence, and here's the truth.
Yes, that's my opinion. I agree with that. I think that we need to get that information out and not suppress it just because it's going to offend somebody.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, well, that's always the truth. Is always at first railed against, and it will offend. But the reality is, people, the vast majority of the people on this planet, the last poll I saw was about 2/3 of the public believe that UFOs are real and the government's hiding some aspect of it. When I first started this effort before Disclosure Project, it was about 25%. So we've sort of won that effort. What hasn't happened is people connecting the dots between that and our history, which is what you're talking about with 2012, right, but also with our future and what the future technologies look like. And this is what really gets exciting, is how can this world be completely transformed through this information and through these new trans-dimensional sciences of consciousness and science of very high voltage physics. So it's a really exciting time to be on Earth, that's for sure.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. It's something, and it's going to be. I'm making a movie as well. I'm doing the script now, and it begins in the late 1800s when there was an explosion of science. Really, my great grandfather was one of the people who invented a light bulb, has a patent on it, invented the telegraph, and then he was one of the first to create a voice transmitter that would transmit over the telegraph lines.
Wow.
Thomas Edison, he had a similar design, but he filed his patent after my great-grandfather, so they had all kinds of patent wars going on. My great-grandfather was best friends with Alexander Graham Bell, who also had a telephone, as everyone knows, design. And so everyone had a light bulb, everyone had an electric generator, he worked on the transmission systems, and he was a really good friend of Nikola Tesla, who they basically swift-boated and hid his technology away.
Correct.
Because the commonality was that Westinghouse was funding them all, and he owned the copper mines. He wanted everyone connected by copper wire. So it starts back then, but then it comes forward, including my bit with the auto industry and what happened there, and it really shows the control. It's the same people. It's the same organizations that grew up and still exist today that are in control. They're in the driver's seat.
Well, actually, I think there's a higher consciousness in the driver's seat, and that's what we have to sync up with, and then that worm will turn. Well, we're about out of time, Michael. I thank you so much for all your information, your great work you're doing. I just wanted to introduce you to our audience. I think you're doing fantastic work, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
All right. We'll talk to you again soon. And again, thanks to all the folks at World Fusion Network for hosting us here every 2 weeks. This is Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer. And until next time, keep looking up. Godspeed. Bye-bye.